Pretty much every athlete knows that hydration is going to be a key to success in competition, but it's oftentimes an underplanned element of an athlete's fueling strategy for competition. So today we're going to talk about what dehydration is, what it's defined as, how do you measure it, and then what are the appropriate strategies to hydrate in competition and plan for that in a way that maximizes the benefit but also minimizes the risks potentially of overhydrating. So, the first thing here that we're going to hit on is what is dehydration? Obviously, I think everybody kind of knows that it's a deficit of body water that's going to have some sort of negative impact on health or performance. Now, in the context of sport and especially endurance competition, historically, a body weight loss threshold has been used as sort of the way to identify or diagnose dehydration in scientific studies. And it's typically a 2% body mass loss or more relative to where you started out before exercise. So that threshold has been tied to, in various studies throughout decades, impairments in performance, particularly aerobic or endurance performance. And it's not 100% consistent. There are some studies that you can go beyond 2% and you're not necessarily going to have negative impacts on performance in every case. In other situations, it may be even slightly smaller than 2%, and you may have some athletes who are negatively impacted, particularly if it's a hot, thermally stressful environment. But 2% is sort of a rough starting point where you more consistently see negative impacts on an athlete's performance. If they surpass that 2% from the time they start exercise to when they're engaging and finishing that competition, if they end the competition 5, 6% dehydrated as a relative amount to their body mass, that's a potential indicator that they haven't consumed enough fluid to the point where it's going to be negatively impacting their performance. Now, why does dehydration negatively impact performance? In terms of endurance sport, one of the primary reasons is you've got less blood volume that is able to be used to deliver oxygen, carbohydrates, other critical nutrients to sustain performance. So as you sweat out more and more fluid, some of that fluid loss is going to come from your blood volume or your plasma volume, and that's going to lead to things like an elevated heart rate for a given workload. It may compromise total blood output or cardiac output, just the liters per minute that your body can pump out. And ultimately, that's going to compromise oxygen delivery, which is going to lead to fatigue or an inability to sustain a given work output. And that's going to be particularly true in hot and humid environments where your body is struggling to supply the various organs and tissues it needs with energy and oxygen because you're having to also cool yourself off in that hot, thermally stressful environment. So your body's getting sending these different signals in terms of it needs blood and oxygen in the working muscle, obviously, to sustain what you're doing physically. But you also have to send some of that blood to the skin and the periphery of your body to cool yourself off. And there's only so much blood that can kind of go around. So particularly in hot and thermally stressful environments, dehydration is going to compromise performance in aerobic sustained physical activities, whether it be running, cycling, or whatever else the athlete may be competing in. There's other reasons that dehydration may compromise performance. Cognitively, it can lead to some issues. There's studies that have suggested that 2% body weight threshold also might apply to kind of cognitive deficits with dehydration. Again, it's not a uniform. Once you get past 2%, it's always going to have a negative impact. But the further you get beyond 2%, the more likely it is the athlete is going to have some negative performance effects, whether it be physically or cognitively. Now, why do we use body weight change as a marker of dehydration, both clinically and in studies when we're looking at during exercise or from pre to post exercise? And that's really because if you think about at least a few hours of exercise, if we ignore, foods you're consuming and mass you're losing from going to the bathroom, any of the changes in body weight that you're going to get, or the majority of the changes in body weight that you're going to experience, are generally going to come from sweat losses. That's going to be the main driver of body mass changes over a few hour period of exercise. Again, it's going to be complicated by the fact that you may be consuming food, you may have gone to the bathroom. There's other things that are playing a role here, but in the context of exercise over a relatively short period of time, most of the body mass changes a person's going to experience are probably going to be coming from sweat losses. So fluid losses, right? Meaning we can use body weight change as sort of a surrogate measurement for body water change. So as a simple example, you might have a 150-pound athlete who's exercised for 2 hours and they've lost 3 pounds of weight from the start of exercise to the end of exercise. Simply take 3 pounds, divide it by 150, and you get 2%. That's a very simplistic explanation of how you'd use that information to estimate sort of dehydration level using changes in body mass. So for that 150-pound athlete, if they're losing more than 3 pounds of weight from the beginning to the end of exercise, they're starting to probably get into a territory of dehydration that may negatively impact their performance. Again, particularly aerobic performance in more thermally stressful environments. Now, what are the factors that ultimately dictate the risk of dehydration? Ultimately, for athletes, it's going to be a combination of factors. It's not just one thing, but the main drivers of fluid loss and more importantly, sweat losses with exercise are going to be work rate, environmental conditions, and drinking behaviors. So, work rate, we mean just on an absolute level, how hard is the athlete working? What's their energy expenditure? As we think about it, energy expenditure is directly tied to heat production. The more heat the athlete is producing, the more heat they're going to have to dissipate, and the more sweating is going to contribute to that body's attempts to regulate heat balance. So, athletes actually who are the fastest finishers in races like a marathon or a Ironman triathlon actually tend to sweat more and tend to end up with larger percentages of body mass loss from the start to the end of the race. So oftentimes what we see is the fastest finishers in marathons and triathlons and other endurance events tend to actually have the largest body mass losses from the start to the end of exercise. And it's in part because their absolute work rate in terms of oxygen consumption or energy expenditure on a per minute basis is higher than athletes who are a bit slower. They have to sweat more to compensate for that, to be able to cool themselves off appropriately. And that's one of the reasons why those better athletes that can sustain higher work outputs tend to actually end up a bit more dehydrated than the slower athletes, maybe in the middle to the back of the pack of the competitors in the race. Now, another factor here is going to be body size and body composition. Larger athletes tend to rely a little bit more on sweating as a means to cool themselves off and the evaporation of that sweat. Because as you kind of make somebody bigger or look at a larger individual, they have less surface area, skin surface area relative to their body volume, which is kind of the heat producing right engine, right? The more muscle you have, absolute amount of muscle, the more heat you can produce. And as you blow someone up in size, they have less surface area relative to that mass or that volume. And it can make it more difficult for them to dissipate heat through other ways, so they have to rely more on sweating as a mechanism to cool themselves off. Beyond work rate and body composition and body size, the other really main driver of sweat rate is going to be the environmental conditions. So, heat, humidity, and solar radiation, so being in direct sunlight, all three of those things are generally going to increase sweating as they go up. So, as temperature goes up, as humidity goes up, as exposure to solar radiation goes up, sweat rates are going to go up as well. Airflow has the opposite effect, where you have higher airflow that's going to act as a way to cool an athlete off convectively, and they may not have to rely so much on sweating. So, an athlete moving through space a bit faster, like a cyclist, may be sweating less, for example, than a runner, although it depends again on a number of other factors to consider unique to those sports. Another clear example of this is running inside on a treadmill without any airflow. You're generally going to sweat a little bit more than outside, assuming all other factors are equal in terms of environmental conditions. So there's a host of things here that can dictate sweat rates, and sweat rate is really going to be the thing that drives risk of dehydration. And there's actually online sort of tools that could predict sweat rates, at least for running and cycling. There is a validated calculator actually that was created and validated through research. And the website simply is sweatratecalculator.com. And if you actually go onto that website, it's going to show really, again, the factors that dictate sweat rates. And you would be plugging in things like your height, your weight, environmental conditions. If you're running on the treadmill, what's your speed? What's the grade of the treadmill? If you're cycling, what's your power output? And you can kind of see and play around with that calculator, and it gives you a sense of how those factors are going to really dictate individual sweat rate. So to sum up, sweat rate is really going to come down to a few different things. Importantly, how hard is an athlete working on an absolute level? Meaning what's the power output, what's their speed, not a relative output. And we're not talking about percentage of max heart rate or percentage of VO2, because that's for an athlete who has lower fitness, they could be working at 80% of their VO2 max or 80% of the max heart rate, but it could be a walk or it could be a slow jog. And that's not really producing enough or expending enough energy to dictate a really high amount of heat production. Whereas an athlete who is very fit, maybe working at even lower percentage of their VO2 max, but is producing more energy and generating more heat. So you can kind of see it really is the absolute work rate. Think caloric expenditure per minute or oxygen consumption per minute that is going to more drive heat production and sweat rates than kind of a relative intensity. Beyond that absolute work rate, it's going to be things like body size and body composition. Bigger athletes and those with more body fat are probably going to sweat more relative to smaller athletes and those with lower levels of body fat. And then, of course, the environmental conditions are going to be a big element that plays a role into how much an athlete is going to sweat. If it's 95 degrees out and 80% humidity, sweat rates are going to be way beyond what they would be in a 50-degree sort of environmental condition with modest humidity. So sweat rates really dictate risk of dehydration. What is going to be a way for an athlete to figure out how much they're going to sweat? How do they do this practically? Well, the easiest thing typically to do is to measure changes in body mass from before to after exercise under a range of different conditions, meaning different environmental conditions or different conditions in terms of intensity of exercise. You kind of want to know, as an athlete, generally what your sweat rates are going to be like under several different sort of scenarios. What happens if you're working at a relatively low percentage of your max heart rate or VO2 max, which would be more applicable to like an ultra marathoner who might be doing a 100-mile race? What does it look like when you're exercising at 50% of VO2 max and sort of a temperate environmental situation or condition? How does that contrast with exercising at 50% of VO2 max in a hot and humid condition? Uh, Alternatively, you might want to know what your sweat rate is at when you're exercising at something like half marathon pace if you're a runner. And again, knowing how it differs between environmental conditions, how heat and humidity may change that. And that's information that you're probably going to collect over months, and it's not going to be something that you're going to have a handle on, in 2 days. So what I would recommend is that periodically athletes are kind of keeping track of their body mass change from pre to post exercise under different environmental conditions during training that allows them to kind of develop an individual profile of sweat rates that they have under various conditions so that you kind of know from one extreme to the other and in the middle where you're going to fall in terms of an expected sweat rate. So logging that information again periodically over the course of weeks or months, I think is a helpful practice for athletes to get an understanding of what their individual sweat rate may be under different conditions. Keeping in mind that work rate and environmental conditions are going to be the big determinants of sweat rate in most conditions. You could also use that online calculator if you're running or cycling to get a rough estimate of your expected sweat rate. It's been validated and is a reasonable way to approximate sweat rates, at least for those exercise modalities, under a range of environmental conditions. So, how would you do this practically? You would, for example, if you're going to go out for a 90-minute run, you would measure your weight before, measure your weight afterwards, and keeping in mind that clothing is going to make a difference here. So you want to kind of standardize this as much as possible. If I do this, it's typically in just like spandex bottoms with the shirt removed, especially if you've been sweating a lot and that sweat is now absorbed into your shirt after the run. You don't want to include that in the measurement because really that's not helping you figure out exactly how much you've sweated over the course of that 90-minute run. So you need to, kind of standardize the weight measurement as much as possible with a scale is accurate. And you also need to consider, did I drink anything or did I eat anything during that run? Because that has to go into the calculation. So, for example, if you lost 2 pounds from the start to the end of that 90-minute run, but you also drank 10 ounces of fluid, you have to account for that in the calculation. And there are online calculators, that you can plug these values into that kind of do the math for you, if you're not comfortable doing this on your own. But basically, you would have to add that weight of the fluid you consumed into the sort of mass loss, right? So if you lost, say, 2 pounds from pre to post workout or 90-minute run, but you also drank 10 ounces, you have to add that 10 ounces to the 2 pounds to really get an idea of about what you would have lost in total had you not consumed that 10 ounces of fluid. Similarly, you need to account for any foods you consumed. Now, if it's not a whole lot, it's if you had a gel or maybe two gels or something like that, it's not going to have a big impact on the numbers here. But you'd also want to account for any food you consumed. And you also need to account for going to the bathroom at all. If you stopped midway through and urinated and produced a relatively large amount of fluid that way, that is also something that needs to be considered in the calculation. I can link in some of the options here for online calculators that takes this information and does the math for you. But basically, if you figure out what is your sweat rate per hour, and you need change in body mass along with fluid consumed and food consumed and any urine production, you need that information to come up with this sweat rate. So typically, sweat rates are going to vary between maybe half a liter per hour up to 3 liters per hour on kind of the extreme end for most people. Most people that are going to be kind of in between those extremes. So that gives you a sense of where typically you're going to see most people fall in terms of sweat rates. So once you have that information, right, that would theoretically allow you to come up with a hydration plan to implement in a similar environmental condition that you expect to happen on race day. But it doesn't apply if the race day environmental condition and the work rate is going to be drastically different from what you just measured in training. So that's again why you kind of want to have an idea about sweat rates under a variety of different conditions in a variety of different work rates so that you know as the race day approaches, you can look at the weather forecast and you can have a sense of perhaps where your sweat rate is going to be reasonably going to be. You're not going to be able to precisely know, but you can probably have a pretty good estimate within, a few hundred milliliters per hour, roughly where you're likely to fall, assuming that the weather forecast is accurate and everything goes according to plan in terms of how hard you're going to be working during the race. Now, what do you do with that information practically? You could try and come up with a plan in terms of the amount of fluid you would need to consume. If, let's say, you expect to run a 3 hour marathon and you're expecting to sweat 1.5 liters per hour, you could come up with a plan in terms of an amount of fluid per hour that you would need to consume to prevent 2% body mass loss by the end of the race. Now, do you have to have that level of precision? It's debated, but that's how you could use that information if you want to target a particular level of body mass loss by the end of the race. If you know your sweat rate, you can then back calculate and figure out really what would be the amount of fluid you need to consume on an hourly basis to prevent that, whether it be 2% or 3%, 4%, whatever body mass loss you're trying to target as the most extreme by the end of the race. So that's how you would use that information practically if you really wanted a highly structured hydration plan. Not every athlete needs that. Really, it's going to be most critical in situations where exercise is longer than 2 hours. Because if exercise is shorter than 2 hours, and assuming you start the exercise or the competition in a well hydrated state, 2 hours really isn't probably enough time for most people to surpass 2% body mass loss unless the environmental conditions are quite extreme and or your work output is quite high. There may be some athletes who certainly are going beyond 2% body mass loss in 2 hours, but especially as you get below 90 minutes, it's pretty unlikely for most athletes to have really, detrimental effects on performance if they're drinking to thirst. They don't really probably need a highly structured hydration plan in most cases when the exercise duration is less than 2 hours, because it's less probable you're going to have enough time to actually accumulate a 2% or greater body mass loss when the duration of exercise is that short. If you go beyond 2 hours, though, that's when it does make more sense to potentially have a structured hydration plan that targets a percentage of your sweat losses. It doesn't have to be 100%, and in some cases, it's not advisable to replace 100% of your sweat losses. But as you go beyond a couple hours of exercise, that is when that structured plan may have some benefits in terms of preventing a performance altering level of dehydration in some situations, particularly those that are hot and humid. Now, when does it not make sense to always rely on body mass changes as a way to track dehydration and dehydration risk? Ultimately, as exercise duration gets into the ultra competition territory, meaning especially as you get beyond 3, 4, 5 hours, the body mass change equation starts to break down in terms of being highly valid as a way to track body water changes. And that's because the longer the exercise goes, the more of your actual internal stores of energy you are using to work and to produce energy. You're breaking down more of your stored carbohydrate or glycogen. You're oxidizing more of your stored fat. And some of the body mass change that you experience is going to come from that. And the longer the exercise goes, the bigger the total caloric costs, and the more that that's going to contribute. Those changes in body mass are going to come from the actual oxidation of things like stored carbohydrate. Beyond that, as you burn through your stored carbohydrates, you're also releasing some of the water that's stored along with the glycogen that may contribute to hydration. So it just becomes a lot more complicated to have a reasonable estimate of your dehydration using body mass loss as exercise gets longer and longer because of these other factors that start to play a role or a more important role as the total energy expenditure becomes a lot higher. There's this quote from an article published in Experimental Physiology in 2017 that sort of summarizes the issue around using body mass as a marker of hydration in very prolonged exercise. And the authors wrote that the assumption of mass and water balance equivalence becomes increasingly inaccurate as more and more energy is expended. Failure to correct for these non-sweat losses will lead to appreciable errors in the estimate of sweating rate and water balance during prolonged exercise, with the error being proportional to the total energy expended. So, as mentioned, the longer an event is, the greater the total energy expenditure, the more issues there are going to be with using body mass as an indicator of dehydration and as a marker of sweat rate. So, for things like ultra running races that may last 5+ hours, it's more reasonable to expect that you're going to have some level of body mass loss by the end of the race, and it may not necessarily negatively impact performance. For example, the Western States Endurance Run, it might be reasonable to expect to have 2 to 5% body mass loss without that really negatively impacting performance because of some of the factors that I just discussed. Even on their website, the Western State Endurance Run, it kind of mentions this as something that most athletes are probably going to experience, and it won't necessarily have a detrimental effect on their performance in that competition. Again, because body mass loss becomes a less valid measurement of dehydration the longer the exercise gets. This is actually something interesting in a paper published in 2026 that looked at Kilian Jornet's performance from the race. He lost approximately 4.3% of his body mass from the start to the end. And clearly he did quite well in the race, finished third, just over 14 hours. It's hard to say whether he would have done any better had he hydrated more or less, but it just goes to show that even the best athletes here who have a lot of experience, obviously a world-class athlete like Kilian, is not coming into the end of that race, with less than 2% body mass loss. I, as a practitioner, as a researcher, working with an athlete, would, in that sort of competition, expect that they're almost absolutely going to come in with more than 2% body mass loss. And if they're not, it's potentially a sign that they are over drinking in that context. So for ultra endurance competitions and athletes, it does become a little bit more problematic, difficult to give really highly precise guidelines around how much fluid you should consume on an hourly basis, in part because of this issue around the validity or the lack thereof of body mass being an accurate indicator of dehydration in those very long events. The other thing with these ultra events is that sweat rates are going to vary throughout the competition with changes in work rates, changes in environmental conditions. Many ultra races start out very early in the morning when it's cold, and then by the time you get to the end of the race or later in the afternoon, it's scorching hot. Changes in altitude and elevation. As athletes start to fatigue, they slow down towards the end of the race. So having a highly rigid hydration plan in the context of an ultra endurance race doesn't probably make as much sense as it would in something like a marathon, regular marathon, where you kind of know what to expect in terms of the duration and the environmental conditions being more consistent across the entirety of that type of competition. So I would say for something like a standard marathon, a structured hydration plan where you're trying to achieve X amount of fluid per hour does make some more sense for a lot of athletes. Ultra athletes is probably a combination of some structure with goals around hydration within some sort of range, but adjusting that based on how things change throughout the race, how you're feeling, thirst levels. It's going to be a bit more of a art to trying to figure out exactly what the ideal hydration approach is in that type of ultra environment. And it's going to be likely to be more customized and individualized, and not so structured that you're locked into a constant fluid intake rate throughout the entire event, because that just doesn't make sense in the context of that type of competition. So to close things out here, I'll summarize what we've kind of talked about. Number one, dehydration does impact performance negatively, particularly for aerobic and endurance exercise that's done in a hot, humid, thermally stressful environment. A 2% body mass threshold has kind of traditionally been cited or referenced in the scientific literature as being the point by which athletes start to have more issues. It's not universal. Certainly, there are athletes who can perform well, even going beyond 2% body mass loss, but it tends to be a threshold beyond which you get more and more issues the further you get from that 2% body mass loss. So 5%, 6%, 8% certainly going to be more consequential than an athlete who's experiencing 3% body mass loss. The other thing to know is that sweat rates are going to be highly individual, both between and within athletes. So between athletes, it's going to be related to their body size, body composition, their overall fitness, and their ability to sustain high levels of absolute work rate. Within athletes, it's also going to vary depending again on how hard they're working in a given training session or during a race. It's also going to depend a lot on the environmental conditions in terms of heat, humidity, solar radiation, airflow, being kind of the main determinants there of sweat rates. Now, we can use information about sweating from documenting changes in body mass during training to have an idea about how we might expect an athlete to lose body fluid during the course of competition. Having a personalized history of measurements in different environmental conditions and at different work rates should allow an athlete to have a reasonable expectation about what their sweat rate might be during competition if they know the forecasts with reasonable accuracy in terms of the weather conditions, and if they have a reasonable idea about what they expect to be working at in terms of a pace, whether it be power output or speed, as a indicator of work intensity. So those are going to be helpful for athletes if they want to develop a structured hydration plan where they replace a given amount of fluid on a per hour basis as a means to prevent, let's say, a 2 or 3% or more body mass loss. For athletes, though, that are doing less than a couple hours of exercise in their competitions, drinking the thirst for many of them is going to be the easiest thing, and it probably isn't necessary for most athletes to go overboard with a structured plan of hydration because there just isn't enough time to accumulate dehydration for most athletes under most conditions. An exception being high-level performers in a hot and humid environment. Certainly, they could sweat more. That would lead to greater than 2% body mass, even within a couple of hours. For athletes who are maybe exercising for a couple hours up to, let's say, 4 to 5 hours, certainly a structured hydration plan, I think, makes a lot of sense in terms of balancing the risks of underhydrating. For competitions that go beyond, let's say, 5 hours, it may not really make as much sense to use a highly rigid structured hydration plan for a couple of reasons. First, the use of body mass change as an indicator of hydration becomes less accurate the longer the event gets and the greater the total energy expenditure gets. Similarly, for a lot of those ultra endurance competitions, There's changes in environmental conditions, in work rates, and access to hydration at aid stations that's going to be more variable than what you get with, let's say, a standard road marathon. So, incorporating information about sweat rates as well as how the athlete is feeling perceptually. Are they able to tolerate more fluid? How's their gut feeling? You kind of have to look at a host of different things in the context of an ultra endurance race to come up with a loose, structured plan about what the hydration approach is going to be, but with the realization that it's going to have to change probably throughout the event, depending on any number of things that arise, whether it be environmental condition changes to how well the athlete is tolerating that fluid in terms of their gastrointestinal perceptions, and whether or not they seem to be performing well. So there isn't as clear cut of a recommendation about what to do during ultra endurance exercise. It comes down to a little bit more of a nuanced approach that incorporates both some structure but also some flexibility to get the benefits of potentially both approaches when there's uncertainty about what is necessarily going to work best.